So let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome to Archaeology and Historic Preservation Month here in Utah. I'm Elizabeth Hora. I'm public archaeologist at the Utah State Historic Preservation Office. This is lecture number 3 of our Brown Bag lecture series. Before we really dive into it today, is that our presentation today will have images of human remains and we will be discussing human remains. Please be respectful. Please remember that these were real living people who had folks who loved them and have folks who still remember and honor them today. I don't expect that this will happen, but if we do have questions or comments on YouTube, Facebook, or Zoom that are inappropriate, we will be taking those down. But I'm sure that that's not going to happen. And we are so excited to welcome Dr. Derinna Kopp. So Derinna Kopp is the head of the Ancient Human Remains program at the Utah SHPO. She has her PhD in Biological Anthropology with an emphasis on skeletal analysis from the University of Utah. And she also has over 20 years experience analyzing and recovering human remains from both archaeological and modern forensic cases. Dr. Kopp will be presenting her research today on perimortem processing and dismemberment and trophy taking of human remains in prehistoric Utah. And so we are very excited and honored to welcome Dr. Kopp here today.
Thank you.
So thank you very much and take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Let me share my screen here and get the presentation started. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about a topic that can be sensationalized and has been sensationalized a lot in the popular media, but it's also a topic that we need to address and we need to discuss and explore because it's an occurrence that we see throughout human history all over the world. And so today we're going to be talking about when we find human remains in archaeological contexts that have been purposefully what we call perimortem processed, which is perimortem means at or around the time of death, purposely broken up, dismembered, that sort of stuff. And we're going to be talking about that with some specific cases that we have had here in Utah. As Elizabeth just said, this presentation will discuss and present photographs of skeletal human remains. This is done for educational purposes, and I ask everyone to please be respectful of this. Also, if this is something that you feel that you don't want to see or to hear discussed, this might not be the best brown bag lecture for you to listen to, and I would completely understand if some individuals choose to step away at any point during this brown bag. I will also mention that all human remains that we are discussing here and that we have been analyzed as part of the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act inventory and determination of cultural affiliation process. These are remains that are going through that process or have already gone through that process. So that is the reason that these analyses were undertaken. First of all, let's do a little bit of a background and history on this. Assemblages containing fragmented, burned, butchered, and broken human bones have been found all over the world in archaeological sites and contexts that cover all of human existence. Just to name a few, this is by no means an extensive or exhaustive list, but just to name a few of the instances that we have found these in archaeological sites. And time periods, we have in Iron Age Britain, remains that have evidence of very violent death, mutilation, and then exhibition of the dead. In Peru, we have evidence of both the Nazca and the Waray peoples taking trophy heads and using body dismemberment for display. In California, we have thousands of years of archaeological sites that have evidence of trophy taking and skeletal dismemberment as part of warfare. We have in Illinois, we have warfare-related scalping and decapitation examples that have been identified. And then, of course, in the southwestern US, we have numerous sites that have broken, fragmented, chopped up, cut up, burned human bone assemblages that have been identified as anything and everything from cannibalism to witch persecution, warfare-related violence, some sort of ritualized violence, violent death, or secondary burial. So we have numerous examples of this within human history. And what this really is our expressions of what we call interpersonal violence. And interpersonal violence isn't just relegated to human existence. We have very clear recordings and evidence of interpersonal, both inter and intragroup violence in chimpanzees, where they have regular infanticide, dismemberment of bodies, even cannibalism of bodies. This has been seen with the use of tools and without the use of tools. Interestingly enough, in chimpanzees, the aggressors are usually young males, but older males and even sometimes females have been recorded doing this sort of interpersonal violence. And even our Pleistocene hominids, our ancestors, we have evidence of the similar treatment and interpersonal violence of remains. So around 800,000 years ago in a cave in Spain, Homo antecessor remains, where there have been clear perimortem processing of infants and immature individuals. The archaeologists at this site said it was similar to the butchering processes and the treatment that were seen in the deer remains from the site. So, this interpersonal violence isn't unique to archaeological humans. It's a side effect of the human condition, really. And it's not just an archaeological phenomenon. We have evidence and accounts during wartime, specifically in World War II, the mutilation of dead Japanese service personnel by Allied forces, which included taking body parts as war souvenirs and war trophies. Most often, this was teeth and skulls that were commonly taken as war trophies, but also other body parts were also collected. And in fact, I personally have identified war trophy skulls that are here in Utah that were brought back during either the World War II or the Korean War by service members. And the families ultimately decided to turn them over. So this is an occurrence that was not uncommon in the middle part of the last century. And it's not uncommon even in this century. We have examples of in January of 2010, 2 soldiers killed an unarmed Afghan village boy and dismembered his body and then posed with photographs with his body. And they were actually ultimately tried and convicted of this war crime. We have evidence of it happening today in Ethiopia with the Tigrayans. There's numerous articles of Tigrayans being rounded up, killed, mutilated, and dismembered as part of that horrible ethnic civil war that's happening currently there. And unfortunately, we have this occurring right now in the Ukraine. We have numerous accounts from numerous journalistic outfits of these type of horrific events happening. One, as the team of district prosecutors office moved through the town of Bucha on Wednesday, investigators uncovered evidence of torture before death, beheading and dismemberment, and the intentional burning of corpses. That's from the Washington Post. From Reuters reviewed a photograph that showed that the face and the body of a victim were badly mutilated. From the Times in the UK, their story was bodies of mutilated children among the horrors the Russians have left behind. And then from the New Yorker, when I returned to the garbage pile the next day, police had cordoned off the mutilated corpses, placing yellow markers with numbers amid the carnage. The markers indicated that there were 6 bodies. So this type of interpersonal violence is happening today. It's not something that is unique to a certain people or a certain time period or a certain group. It's just common throughout humanity. And today, of course, we're going to focus on Utah And Utah is not immune to this either, especially within our archaeological scene. So within Utah, we have in the certain around 500 BC to around 1300 AD, we have a group that is known by archaeologists as the Fremont. And they covered most of Utah, all the way down to except to the very extreme southern part of the state. The extreme southern part of the state at that time would have what we call ancestral Puebloans, or what some people call the Anasazi. But throughout most of the rest of Utah, the Fremont lived during that time period. And there have been several, a handful of Fremont sites, especially from the central south, south central, excuse me, part of Utah that have had these types of assemblages. Specifically, we have Batco Village, Nothis Village, Snake Rock Village, possibly Turner Look site, and then Five Finger Ridge, which is a site we're going to discuss today. And they all have assemblages of human remains that have been broken up, dismembered, burned, cut, really highly fragmented. We also have evidence within Utah of what has been identified as secondary burial or possibly ritual defleshing. This is specifically, most recently was found in 3 sets of human remains that were recovered by police in the 1980s from an individual's backyard and in Salt Lake County, so in northern Utah. And what we identified here was these were nearly complete skeletons, and they didn't have any extreme fragmentation or fracturing, but they had very cut marks at very specific locations where there were muscle attachment points or bone articulation points. And so, and yet the skeletons were very complete. So we identified this as possibly most likely secondary burial or defleshing. And what secondary burial is a common practice within many cultures where after the individual has died and their body has decomposed or mostly decomposed or partially decomposed, they then disarticulate the body and almost package it into a smaller package. Sometimes those are placed in pots or baskets. Sometimes they're placed in little alcoves or small spots in the environment. But it's just a natural, normal part of different cultures' burial practices. We also have some examples of what we would identify as trophy taking, specifically in the Sevier Valley. This is in, again, that central, south central Utah. There was a pit house structure in which 3 skulls were found in the roof fall. So these skulls would have been placed in the roof or kept in the roof during the lifetime for the use of that pit structure. And these 3 skulls were only the skulls, and they have very distinct evidence of decapitation around the base of the skull. So we have that. But today, you know, I realize I bit off a little more than I could chew wanting to cover all of the things in my title. So I decided to focus on Five Finger Ridge, because it is an amazing site with very important information to tell us, but also it really shows, and our analysis of it really shows how, as scientists, we go about trying to figure out what we have when we're looking at these assemblages of remains. So let's talk a little bit about Five Finger Ridge. Five Finger Ridge is located in south central Utah, near what is now known as Fremont Indian State Park, off of I-70 in central Utah. Fremont Indian State Park was actually created because Five Finger Ridge was there. Five Finger Ridge was a really large archaeological site that was ultimately, the ridge itself was completely destroyed after the excavations and to be used as fill for the construction of I-70. So the site was recorded and excavated beginning in 1983 by BYU, and specifically their Office of Public Archaeology. Again, as mitigation for this very large construction site of this highway that bisects Utah east to west. So Five Finger Ridge was a very unique site. It was a very large Fremont habitation site. There were 117 separate architectural features that were identified. 81 of those were identified as structures. 33 of those were identified as activity areas, and then there were 3 that they couldn't quite place as to what their function was. The radiocarbon dates and associated artifacts that were recovered indicate this is that Fremont population affiliation that we have. And radiocarbon dating places the site occupation of about a 350-year span, from right around 1000 AD to right around 1350. The largest amount of people, or largest populations, were living on the ridge in the 1200s, and then it was really sparse between that 1300 to 1500, and then abandonment occurred right around 1350. Excuse me, 1350. So interestingly enough, for a site that was lived on for 350 years with 81 structures, there were no primary burials found. And when I say primary burials, what I mean is a burial where the person has died, the individual's loved ones, families, community buried them as to their, in a single burial pit with the entire body there. None of those were found. And I really think this in and of itself is probably a master's thesis, looking at the Fremont burial patterns and why this site and possibly one other near there had no primary burials associated with it when there was such a long habitation period. So that's an interesting question that needs to be answered in and of itself. The human remains that were found were fragmented human remains that were found in at least 16 different structures on the site. And those structures have been dated to 2 main time periods or date ranges. The first one and the largest one of where the most remains come from is right around AD 1220 to about 1250. And remember, this is when the largest occupation of the site was happening. And then there's a much smaller amount of human remains that were found in structures that date to that terminal period, that 1300 to 1350, right before abandonment. So this is when the remains in the structures were found that they date to. The highest concentration of remains within the site were found within 2 structures. It's structure 20 and structure 36. Both of those are pit houses. And they were recovered from the floors of the pit house. And the remains are very highly fragmented. And in fact, they're so highly fragmented and in such small fragments that about a third of what have been identified as the human remains were initially thought to be faunal or animal remains from the site. And they were only recently discovered and pulled out of the faunal remains through part of this analysis and another analysis that was done by another individual. So that just can give you an idea of how small these fragments are and how much these human remains have been fragmented. So here's a map of Five Finger Ridge. It's called Five Finger Ridge because it has 5 fingers. It has this one that comes out here, and it comes out there, and it comes out there, and it comes out there, and then comes out there. So big 5 fingers that go out on the top of this ridge. And wherever you see red is where human remains were found on the site. So you can see it's not concentrated to one portion of the site. It's pretty much throughout the site. And the 2 largest red stars right here are where structure 20 and structure 36 are. And today we're going to focus on structure 20 and structure 36 because, like I said, that's where the vast majority of these human remains were found. So structure 20, like I said, it was a pit house. Human remains were found scattered across the floor of the pit house and in the fill, which makes perfect sense for if they were scattered across the fall, they might migrate up a little bit. We had an MNI. MNI stands for minimum number of individuals. And in instances like this, where we don't have complete skeletons, we don't have complete bones, we just have fragments, what we do is we estimate a minimum number of individuals that is represented by those fragments. The way we do this is we identify every fragment as to which skeletal element it belongs to, which side and which portion of that skeletal element it belongs to. And then we find the portion of skeletal element that is represented the most in the collection, and that's our MNI. So for instance, everyone only has one right femur. So if we found 10 proximal right femurs, which is the upper part of the right femur, we would know we would have to have at least 10 individuals in that collection. In this pit house, we had an MNI of 3. We had one subadult, that just means a child, and then 2 younger adults, which were between about the age of 20 and 40 years old. There are indications, and the archaeologists who excavated this noted that there were indications of a fire, likely right at post-habitation or sometime shortly after post-habitation. And the structure itself and the contents within the structure date to about AD 1220, which again is right in the middle of that the largest population within on the ridge. Structure 36 was a little bit different. Again, it's another pit house, but the remains were found in a pile, about a 1 meter by 2 meter big pile between the hearth and the southeast wall. In this structure, we had an MNI of 5, 2 subadults and 3 adults. And again, the structure dates to right at that same time, AD 1230. Now these are radiocarbon dates, and if you know radiocarbon dates, you know that AD 1220 and AD 1230 and radiocarbon dates are statistically the same date. We can't get down to exact years with radiocarbon dates. We get down to a mean year with a standard deviation, and then we correlate that with some other dating techniques that we have to get a range. So the fact that they are so close pretty much indicates they date to the exact same time period and the exact same time. So it's probable, I would say, that these remains were both from the exact same instance in history, just happening in 2 different structures. So our methods for this. So first of all, substantial time was spent identifying the remains to develop the MNIs, what fragments belong to what bones. But then we spent a lot of time what we call refitting or reconstructing elements. So we actually would take all the little fragments and see if we could match any of them up and make larger elements or portions of elements from it. After that, each fragment was examined individually with a 14x magnification hand lens, a little hand lens that we looked through with, and then we looked at it at 20 and 40x bifocal microscope. And the traits we recorded 14 different traits. And these are traits that have been identified in the literature as important to understand the frequency of them within an assemblage to try and figure out what happened. So basically they're traits that, and I'll go into a few of them and describe a few of them here in a minute, that show how much human modification was done to them. And then we also note if there is any animal, what we call taphonomy or animal alteration in the form of rodent gnawing or carnivore damage. So let's talk about the human remains. So in all, we had about 1,600 fragments of human bone. And I think anyone looking at this picture would understand why a third of them were originally thought to be possibly faunal remains, because if you're not an expert in identifying human bones, most of these are not easily identifiable as human remains. But we did have around 1,600 fragments that we ultimately looked at. And some of the things we noticed, first off, we noticed that there was very patterned processing. The remains were broken up and in fragments that were similar. So here we have 2 eye orbits from 2 separate individuals that you can tell they were broken in exactly the same manner, in the same way. Both of them have evidence of being hit right here or right here. There are similar fractures on the other sides. This one happened to fracture down the middle. This one, if they probably did another blow, it probably would have fractured in the exact same location. So we have these remains that are broken up in the exact same way. Here's another example where we have two femurs. These are the proximal femur heads, so the ball and socket of your hip joint, that are broken in the exact same location. And in fact, they also have cut marks in the exact same location. So this one is black because it's been burned, but right here, we zoom in, you can see the really fine cut marks. And if you look at this one, we zoom in, you can see it's a little bit harder because they're by the fracture margin, but we have cut marks right there. The location of these cut marks tells me that these cut marks were most likely related to disarticulation of the femur from the hip socket, and also possibly muscle removal from that, because that's right where that capsule goes into the bone and articulates with the bone, and then a lot of muscles attached there. So similar, broken up in similar methods, similar locations for cut marks. This was a pattern process. This wasn't, you know, a wild, frenzied, free-for-all, just do whatever, get it over fast. This was done methodically and systematically. We have cut marks. This is a foot bone that down here at the base, you can see some very fine cut marks also. This would have been on the top of the foot. We have what we have identified as chop marks, which would have been done with like a hand axe or some sort of heavier piece of stone tool. And so this is a tibia, this is a shin bone. And right on the front of it is where these hack marks are. And you can see the blue tape here. We use a low tack blue tape to temporarily connect the fragments after we've refitted them. But you'll see here, you can actually see every single mark of where that axe went in. It went right here, and then it became angled, and right here, and right here, and right here, and right here. And this one was strong enough to go all the way down to here. So you can see that, I mean, a lot of force. This is one of the thicker parts, one of the thicker bones of our body. And so a lot of force went into breaking this bone. We have percussion pits. So what percussion pits are is when a stone or an object is used to hit a bone, as it goes in, it won't be completely nice and round. It'll hit the spot where it hits, makes a little flake of bone come off. And so that's what this is right here. It's just right where the point of impact, a little flake of bone came off, and it created this little percussion pit. We also see peeling, and what peeling was, peeling is, lets us know that this was done when the bone was very fresh. So if you think of when you take a green twig off of a tree and you try to break it in half, it doesn't just snap, it actually kind of peels, and it peels up. Sometimes it's called a green stick fracture, but this peeling lets us know that, again, this happened when the bone was what was called fresh. It had all of its fat, all of its marrow in it, all of its liquid in it. And that would be this right here, this peeling that we see. And then we have pot polish, and we'll talk a little bit more about pot polish here in a minute. But we identified pot polish, and what pot polish is it's this shiny, kind of flattened area on this margin right here of this fragment. And the idea with pot polish is that as bones are boiled in a ceramic vessel, they move around, and as they're moving around, the edges or the points of them brush up against the roughened internal side of that ceramic vessel, and that creates a polish. Well, like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. And so we did identify that within this assemblage as well. So as you can see, we identified a variety of all of the things. You will notice that the animal alterations of carnivore 9 and carnivore damage and rodent 9 were minimal to non-existent. So we did not identify any of that. But perimortem fractures, which are fractures that occurred at or near the time of death, were very large. On average, if you take the entire site, it's over 95%. But we identified every one of those 14 important features to look at when we're trying to figure out what happened with these bones. So what do we have? So just from this little bit of our analysis, we definitely can say that we have deliberate processing or dismemberment of bodies that occurred at or near the time of death. This was complete disarticulation of the skeleton to the extreme, really, leaving many tiny small fragments that we had. This pattern that we see is similar to what we see in the dismemberment of faunal remains in archaeological sites. This processing of remains that we see. So what is this processing of remains? Well, quite often here, especially in the American Southwest, it has been termed as cannibalism. And that was really popular to talk about and to discuss and try and prove it was cannibalism in the late 90s, early 2000s, and whether that was starvation or survival cannibalism or some sort of ritualized cannibalism. Various investigators had different beliefs on that. Could it just be mutilation and dismemberment associated with warfare or intimidation, which we know is very common among many or all humanity and has been seen in many archaeological sites? Was it some form of secondary burial that we see? Or was it some sort of witch persecution? And I didn't really go into witch persecution very much, but we have some very distinct ethnographic examples of witch persecution from the Puebloan tribes, in which the murder and the dismemberment of the bodies is quite similar to some of the things we see. And so some investigators have really said that this is something that needs to be examined more. In these Puebloan tribes, witch persecution always peaks around times of communal stress or communal discord. And so that might be something that could be a clue that we could look for other things that were happening on the site, any environmental issues or stuff that might be occurring that might help us try and figure that out too. So these are the questions we have to ask. And we decided to start with cannibalism and to start to see, could these remains, are they consistent with what other remains that have been identified as cannibalism exhibit, and could this be that? So we focused on one key instance with remains or assemblages that have been identified as cannibalism to begin with. So that is pot polish that we talked about a little bit ago. So pot polish, as I said, refers to the reflective bevel with internal striations on margins of fragmented remains that is purportedly caused by the movement of those remains in a boiling pot along the abrasive internal surfaces of ceramic cooking vessels. So investigators who have previously examined and identified what they have identified as cannibalized remains have said that the presence of pot polish is key in identifying whether remains have been cannibalized or not. And so what we noticed was that we have a really low incidence of what we identified as pot polish. Depending on the structure in the site, we're really low. We're down around 5%, give or take, of identified pot polish. So we wanted to know more about what is pot polish and how does it come about. So we did a little pot polish study, a study in which we examined the manifestation of pot polish. It was an assemblage of butchered and processed bones that were butchered and processed using stone tools and then boiled in a Fremont replica style vessel. And our main questions were, how long do fragments have to boil to exhibit pot polish? And we hypothesized that the longer the boil time, it would increase the amount of, or the frequency that we saw of pot polish. So what we did was we took mutton forelimbs, so sheep forelimbs. We went to a local grocery store that sells mutton, and we purchased 6 different forelimb forelimbs, which included the shoulder blade, the upper arm, and then the two arms, the two bones of the lower arm. And we butchered them using stone tools. Here we are butchering and removing the tissue with obsidian blades. And then we broke up the bones using stone tools, a hammer stone and an anvil, so much that we got fragments. And then we boiled those fragments in a Fremont replica style vessel that an archaeologist friend of ours was kind enough to loan us and let us borrow. And we boiled them. And what we did was we divided them up into groups where we boiled them for 10, 20, 30, or 40 minutes. And then we also had a butchered and fragmented but unboiled limb that served as our control or our time zero. So we didn't boil that at all. And then afterwards, every margin and every point, and when I say margin, I mean the flat right here, margin, fracture margin. And when I say point, I mean the little pointy points. We looked at every point and every margin of the 5 assemblages under a 20x bifocal microscope and recorded the presence and the amount of polish that we saw. And just so you know, here's what some of it looked like. So here in the upper corner is an unpolished. There's no polish on this fracture margin right here. Whereas right here is a very thick, wide, beveled polish on this margin right here. You can see those striations they talk about along it right there. The black is just pencil marks of where we marked certain aspects of the fragment that we needed to look at. Okay, so what did we find? Well, we found that indeed the amount of pot polish increased pretty dramatically with boiling. So you'll see that at 40 minutes, between 75 and 95% of the points and margins had pot polish on them after 40 minutes. You'll also notice that the amount of polish kind of increases quite a bit. So there's quite a bit of polish even after 10 minutes on these margins, and then it kind of plateaus off shortly after 20 minutes. I also hope what you're noticing is that here are time zeros, unboiled, only broken up, butchered and broken up, but unboiled, had what we identified as polish on them. And the reason why is that what we have identified this as is this is most likely burnishing that has happened during the butchering and especially the breaking up process, the fragmentation process. They're using that stone, hammer stone, to break up the bones. As it breaks through the bone and makes that fracture, it continues a little bit more beyond that fracture, and it itself burnishes that fracture margin. This is a phenomenon that was briefly mentioned by Turner and Turner in 1999 in their large study of possible cannibalized remains, but they didn't elaborate on it, and they definitely didn't examine it anymore. So this burnishing that we find in our time zeros is actually probably really important, because the frequency of this polishing or burnishing that we identify in our time zero fragments, 60% of our margins and 34% of our points, was, while it was statistically much lower than what we saw in the actual oiled fragments, it was within the range of frequencies that have been identified in many of these assemblages that have been determined as being cannibalized because they have this presence of this pot polish. In fact, White, in his 1992 study, he only had 6% of this polishing, which is about what we had in Five Finger, right? And he identified it as cannibalism because it had this 6%. So this presence of this burnishing, this stone tool burnishing, is very important. And we think it's something that really needs to be examined further, and we need to understand. And all these cases that have been identified as possible cannibalism needs to go back and actually look at and see if we can distinguish between true hot polish and just this stone tool burnishing or this polish. So that was our next step as scientists, you answer one question, you ask 25 more. So our next step was, can we distinguish between pot polish, true pot polish, and stone tool burnishing? And so we did a quick, and I say quick, it was actually painstakingly, mind-numbingly, eye-crossingly boring, but we did a quick pilot study in which we tried to distinguish between burnishing and true pot polish. And the way we did this was we went back to our sheep fragments again, our time zeros, and the ones that we had boiled, and we looked to see what we could look at to try and quantify any difference between these. And we settled on looking at the width of the polished bevel, or how wide that bevel of that polish is, and then also the distance between those striations to see if there was any statistical difference between those. So because this was just a pilot study, we focused mainly on the time zeros and the 40-minute boil times, because we knew we would have plenty to measure then. And this is an example of how we did it. This is an exact, I just did this for this presentation, but this is how we did it. We have the microscope image in which we have it calibrated, which means we can use a program to actually take accurate measurements from it. And what we would do, again, I just did this for this presentation, so this isn't as accurate as it would have been. We measured, we denoted the margins of the bevel so that we could get the width all along the length of the bevel. And then we denoted each of the striations. And then we got the distance between the striations. And we then analyzed those, looking at the means and doing some t-tests between the two groups. And interesting enough, for the distance between striations, so the distance between the striations on that bevel, the points, for both points and margins, the time zeros had much further distance. These are in millimeters, so we're looking at really tiny distances, but larger distances between the striations than the 40-minute boil time, which makes sense because if those striations are truly caused by either the stone going through the fragment or the fragments going around, the more they go around, the more striations they're going to have, the closer they're going to be together. So that was statistically significant that there was greater distance between the striations and thus therefore less striations between on the time zeros or the unboiled than there were on the 40-minute. Then we look at the width of the bevel, and the width of the bevel for both the points and the margins was significantly greater than in the 40-minute boils, time than in the time zeros. So true pot polish had a wider bevel than the burnishing did. And again, that was statistically significant. So we think that these two features could be really important. And there's probably more that if we looked through our microscopes a lot more at these fragments that we could suss out. But we think that these are two important features that at least need to be examined further so that we can truly get to an understanding of what is true pot polish and what is this stone burnishing, because this is really important. If you're going to say some remains have been cannibalized, you need to be certain, and you don't want to identify stone burnishing, which can just happen from regular breaking up of the bones, which can be caused by any of the other features, any of the other possibilities that I've mentioned, versus the cannibalism. So any future analyses, they really need to include this level of analysis, looking at the fragments to see whether this was possibly stone burnishing or if it was true pot polish. So the next thing we looked at was, okay, so again, we're still trying to see what do we think we have. So were these remains processed similar to food? If there's cannibalism, were they processed similar to food? And so what we thought of is we have all the faunal remains, so let's look at those. So if the processing frequency patterns between human and large mammal remains are similar, then this could indicate that they were both processed in similar manners and possibly therefore used for similar purposes. So we looked at the large-bodied mammals that were the bones that were recovered from structure 20 and 36. And we looked at them for all the same features that we looked at the human remains for. And ultimately what we saw was that the faunal or the animal bones are in light blue, the human are in dark blue. For 20, the animal remains were much, much more heavily processed. Indeed, a lot more heavily processed. For structure 36, and for the majority of them, they were also animal. Pink is the faunal and red is the human. The faunal remains were more heavily processed. There was a couple instances, perimortem fracturing and percussion striae and percussion pits where the humans had more. And then there were a couple in 36 where they were about the same, interconchoidal scars, burning, and crushing. So then we did some statistical analyses to say, you know, are they indeed different than what we would expect? And we did some chi-square incidence rates tests to see that. And everything that's bolded here shows that there is a significant difference between what the incidence was that we saw and what would be expected if the human remains had been processed similar to animals. And like I said, overall, the faunal remains have a higher incidence of processing than the human remains. The human remains were not processed to the same extent as the faunal remains, which could then indicate that possibly they were not used for or the same purposes or processed in the same manner as the food sources were. Okay, so what does all this mean, right? So from this site, we know that we have evidence of extreme violence among the Fremont, that we have the deliberate patterned dismemberment of bodies at or near the time of death, that while these patterns do resemble the processing that the faunal or the animal remains from the site also exhibit, that they're not nearly as severe or to the same extent. And we know that while these are similar to remains that have been identified as cannibalism, we are lacking that hallmark of pot polish and most likely have a stone tool burnishing that's happening going on just from the butchering process. So that leads us to, this is more likely some sort of warfare, intimidation violence, possibly secondary burial and violence, possibly ritual dismemberment, or witch persecution. So our next steps for this are to do the research into those and see what those types of instances would create on bones, and then try and figure out if the bones that we have might represent one of those. And that's where our next steps are. These remains have, they're no longer with us. They have been repatriated, I do believe already. So we will be doing this just on the information that we recorded during our analysis. Okay, that's it. I want to thank all my co-investigators. There were many because we had quite a few different little experiments going on and recordings happening. And I also want to thank all the individuals at the Fremont Indian State Park, Utah State Parks, that allowed me and had me do this analysis for them, and then worked with me through all this analysis. So that is it. Are there any questions?
Yeah, thank you so much, Derinna. We do have several questions. So since they're coming in right now, it's going to be a little bit of a potpourri. Also, we have 8 minutes until 1 p.m. Is it okay if we go a little bit over? Is that all right?
Yes, we can go a little bit longer.
It's been a tradition this year that everyone's had such fantastic questions that we've gone over. So the first question that we had come in was early on. I think it was when you showed a piece of human bone that had not been burned and that had been burned. Someone had popped the question up, were there any cremation burials at 5 Finger?
No, so the prehistoric people of Utah really didn't do cremation burials. I know that's really common in the central part of the US and in other areas, but we have not found many creation burials, and the bones that we have found that have burned, they've all been similar to this, fragmented, have trauma, perimortem trauma, and then burned. after that. So the Fremont did not regularly practice cremation burial, no. The ones, that little fragment that was burned, I believe that was from the Pit House 20. That had that post-habitational burn, that femur that was burned, yeah.
Okay, really, really interesting. Thank you. From Facebook, we had the question, why were remains deposited on the floor of pit houses? And do we know if they were placed after the pit house was used, or was that pit house being occupied while there were remains in or around them?
That's a really good question. So the reason that they were most likely deposited on the floors of the pit house, whether in a pile or whatnot, was that was how the individuals who perpetrated this dismemberment and this butchering disposed of them. We currently, in our mind, a lot of people like to call that maltreatment or inconsiderate treatment of human remains, but that's really, I think, a Western idea being forced upon these prehistoric people. And so I would never say that they, did it out of anger or malice. It's quite possibly that they did it out of anger, malice, intimidation, terrorism, that sort of thing, but we don't know yet. And so we really need to understand, why. So both of these two pit houses that I talked about, the human remains were deposited either at the terminal date of occupation or shortly after that. So these remains, individuals did not continue living in these pit houses after this occurred. It was right at the time of abandonment for these. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that. We have 2 more questions. So, since fragmented human remains were found in other structures at this site, has there been an attempt to see if the fragments from other structures can be pieced together? Could the bodies have been distributed among the different structures or processed separately?
Yes. So in fact, we know that there are at least 2 instances where two fragments from 2 separate pit houses on different parts of the ridge matched up. So there were parts of bones or bones from the same bone fragments separated and taken to 2 separate pit houses. So yeah, they were distributed. And we have at least, I think, 2 or 3 instances where that happened. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So then remind me, was Five Finger Ridge excavated in its entirety?
It was not. So unfortunately, Five Finger Ridge was not initially identified as an archaeological site before construction of I-70. And once they started removing fill from the ridge to use for I-70 is when they found the site. And so they did some trenching to identify the extent of the site. They excavated every structure they found, but there's likely things that they did miss because of the nature of the discovery and when it occurred. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. Can we assume that cannibalized human remains were cooked before eventual consumption, or could that cooking have served another purpose, i.e. to ease the defleshing process?
That's a good question. So we can't assume anything when it comes to what Western individuals have identified as cannibalized remains. We can't even assume that they were indeed cannibalized. There have been some instances where with second looks by other individuals, the remains have actually been that were thought to be cannibalized early on by individuals have then been decided, no, this wasn't, this was just defleshing for secondary burial or that sort of thing. So we can't really assume anything. All we know is that there are instances where bones have this polishing, and it has been identified as pot polish. That indicates that the remains have been boiled in a pot at some point in time. Now, normally, it could be, if it's getting down to the bone to polish it, that's usually indicates that there's not much flesh on the bone, that it's been mostly defleshed already, similar to what we did in our analysis, in our experiment. But could it be that they were boiled to get the fats and the marrows out? Possibly. Could it be that they were boiled with meat on and then the meat was taken off and then continued boiled, or to help with the defleshing process? That's all a possibility. And that's, again, another master's thesis right there, figuring out what it could be. But also it could just be that stone tool burnishing that we're identifying, and it's not even pot polish at all in a lot of these cases.
Yeah, I've got two questions that go a little bit beyond the human remains themselves and are more about cultural practices that we may or may not know of for the Fremont culture. Could the defleshing have been related to ancestor veneration, maybe the heirlooming of bones?
Right, it definitely could have. That is something that, I mean, the Fremont are this really unique population that every time we think we know something about them, we learn something new that we don't know about them, right? You know, and so it could have been, and it could be something that possibly needs more research into it. Usually, when we see this ethnographically, whether it's mortuary cannibalism or mortuary veneration like that, it's not the bones aren't fragmented to this extent. It's more like what we saw in those bones from Salt Lake City. They were defleshed, that sort of thing, but they're not this broken up and cut up and really, really violent dismemberment of the body. So that's usually, I would assume that, I don't think that's normally what we see with that type of thing. Yeah. But we don't know what the Fremont did. There's a lot we don't know about them.
Okay, yeah, this makes more sense. Thank you. So Paul has been waiting to have his question answered very patiently. Thank you, Paul. He's interested in connecting some of your results here to some of the rock imagery up around the vernal area that would indicate violence, warfare, things of that nature. And if in your research you've had any thoughts about that, or if you know of any connections that may be made by your research or future research.
Right. So yeah, the rock art, especially the ones where it appears as if the individual is holding a head and that sort of stuff. Yeah. You know, we haven't looked into that. A lot of people who have looked at the other Fremont sites have brought that rock art into play and said, you know, it shows that there is, you know, something going on where, you know, if they're depicting this, it's happening most likely. But we haven't specifically looked at that in this instance, no.
Thank you. And can I just also add on to that these are not Polaroids. These are staged rock imagery. So it's always a little bit, you've always got to take that with a little grain of salt of who was the audience, who was the person communicating for. But I appreciate that this is something that you've been considering. So thank you. Connie asks, how did Fremont people typically bury their own deceased? How does this differ from the mean?
Very good question. So the Fremont, they had what we in archaeology would consider really standardized burials. They often buried their dead in pits, usually because they were digging with wood and stone tools. They weren't necessarily deep pits. Often the burials were what we call in the fetal position or kind of curved up. They would bury their dead pretty much wherever and wherever they could. So we do find quite a bit of them in the floors of pit houses, usually under the hearth areas. And archaeologists have assumed that is because the deaths occurred possibly in the winter when the ground was frozen, and that was the only ground that could be dug up easily. But there's, you know, a myriad of other possible reasons. Oftentimes we also find them in the middens of the site. Again, the middens would have soil that was much easier to dig into. It's not a value placed upon those individuals. It's probably just that they were, it was easier to dig in there. We find Fremont individuals buried with and without grave goods. It's not uncommon for them to have no grave goods at all, but it's we have several instances where it would be some utilitarian grave goods, a mono or metate, some pottery. There have been some where it looks like they have been more venerated burials, where they have certain raptor head skeletons with them, or other types of objects that look like those individuals might be a little more venerated. But they were, you know, in the ground burials for the most part. But again, that's like I said, this would be an amazing, another master's thesis for a student to look at the breadth of all the human burials through Fremont sites that we have, and to see, you know, why an occupation site that had 350 years of occupation had no primary burials associated with it. That would be interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting, because looking at the, you know, potential populations, when we're looking at like population frequencies as far as pit houses and, you know, other sorts of remains that we think indicate more people, we're missing an awful lot of folks. So two more questions, and then I think we will call it for the day. And thank you so much for staying late with us. Compassionate Cannibalism by B.A. Conklin, 2001, has documented perimortem processing as part of the grieving process. Are there any indications on these human remains that these individuals may have been associated with a specific group? And I assume a specific group that is participating in the grieving process in this way.
Right, yeah, so that unfortunately we don't know. You know, to understand group membership within a population, especially in an assemblage that's this fragmented, we would have had to do probably some destructive analyses, specifically looking at isotopes that help us know locality. And that wasn't possible in this case because it was a NAGPRA case. But so we don't know. We don't know, were these individuals that lived there? Were the individuals that were brought in? We don't know that. And so we don't know who they were really, and how they were related to Five Finger Ridge.
Okay, thanks. Last question, is there any evidence for a change in the various treatments of human remains assigned to a particular time period? And he's sort of thinking, you know, cross time, are we able to see that there's more or less, you know, pot boiling, more or less, you know, something of that?
Right, so among the Fremont, there's not a lot of variation in burial practices over time. Among the whole Fremont time period that we see. It's pretty standard, it's pretty set. With these, so again, with the Fremont, you'll notice, if you remember, and I meant to point out the dates of the sites that we have had this identified. They're from as early as the 800s AD to as late as that 1350 AD. So it's not one specific time period that we're seeing these remains come from. In the Southwest, it's more often associated with the late Pueblo II and the early Pueblo III that we see it, but in the Fremont, it's not one specific grouping. I mean, that's about a 400-year, 500-year time period that we're seeing it in. So that is and I don't think we've seen an uptake in the processing of it or of the amount of pot polish between those. I don't think anyone's ever looked at that. No.
So thank you once again to Dr. Derinna Kopp for volunteering her time with us today. This was absolutely wonderful. I know that we all learned a lot, and thank you so much for your presentation. We hope that all of you joining us will be with us next week for our final brown bag of the year. And thank you all as well for joining us, and we'll see you next time.